All right, I think we're going to get started. People are rolling in. So good afternoon, and thank you to everyone for joining us today for a conversation on culturally relevant practice. Last week, the Frederick D. Patterson Research Institute released a new report titled Culturally Relevant Practice, Implementation Among Historically Black Colleges and Universities. The purpose of the report is to discuss UNCF's foundational approach to implementing programs with HBCUs and Black students. In 2020, in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent uprisings that highlighted issues of systemic racism, not only in law enforcement, but education, media, housing, finance, and other areas, we saw many organizations and corporations pivoting to focus on Black communities, Black students, and schools in an effort to advance equity. We saw this pivot as an opportune time to underscore the importance of culturally relevant practices in working with these groups. The issue of cultural knowledge and relevance is particularly important in K-12 and higher education spaces, as we aim to create programs that increase success among a specific underserved group of students. As we know, the reason that these students and the institutions that serve them continue to be underserved or disadvantaged is the absence of effective communication practices explicitly designed for them. Today, we will discuss the importance of equity-focused research and its use for program design, underlining our own use of the principles of Black feminist thought in student success programming with HBCUs. We hope this conversation is useful for all institutions and organizations interested in centering equity in their work with Black institutions and students. I want to begin by introducing myself and giving the scholars we've invited to this conversation an opportunity to tell you a little bit about themselves. Good afternoon again, everyone. I am LaToya Owens. I'm the Director of Learning and Evaluation for the Frederick D. Patterson Research Institute. Welcome again. And we can go to my colleague, Nadrea.
Hi, everybody. Nadrea Njoku here, Senior Research Associate at the Frederick D. Patterson Research Institute. Really excited to have everyone here today. Most excited to have these two beautiful scholars with us to discuss the report.
Hello, everybody. My name is Lori Patton Davis, and I am Chair for the Department of Educational Studies and Professor of Higher Education and Student Affairs at The Ohio State University. And my research agenda, broadly conceived, focuses on racial inequities in higher education and how those racial inequities sit at the intersection of gender, class, and other markers of identity and systems of oppression. And a huge part of my research agenda centers the experiences of Black people in educational spaces. And for me, in this conversation, Black women.
Great. Good afternoon. Thank you, first of all, LaToya and Nadrea, for having us here. It's always a beautiful thing when I can be in conversation with Dr. Patton Davis. So thank you for giving us an excuse to get together this afternoon. My name is Dr. Venus Evans Winters, also known as Dr. V. I am a research and policy scholar. I'm also a licensed clinical social worker and a licensed clinical psychotherapist in private practice, as well as a certified clinical trauma professional. I'm also the founder of Planet Venus Institute and Planet Venus. I'm also a research scholar with the African American Policy Forum at this time. As far as my research looks at Black women's and girls' psychosocial and educational development across the lifespan. For the most part, I look at Black girls and Black women's and the Black communities in general's experiences from a Pan-African and Afrocentric lens with a specialized focus on Black women's epistemology. Again, thank you for having me here.
Thank you. Thank you. We're really excited about this conversation today. And I want to just go ahead and jump in and get started with our first question. So for the scholars on the line, do you feel there is a disconnect between equitable research and practice? And if so, we want to talk about why that disconnect may exist. We can start with you, Dr. V.
That's an interesting question. I like to start off, Black History Month positively, with positive thoughts. But I have to say that right now my thinking is I know for sure that there's a disconnect. I don't think it's just based off feelings. Even if we look at Dr. Patton's work, Dr. Patton Davis's work, and other scholars, Black women scholars, Black people scholars, and I mean, we can go as far back as W.E.B. Du Bois, Septima P. Clark, Gwendolyn Brooks, and even today, some of our contemporaries. It's more than obvious that there is a disconnect in our ideas about equity and research or practice, like equity as research, equity as a set of practices, and equity as beliefs. And right now, when we look at even the trajectory of Black people in higher education, it's almost like we can get in to the door, but do we stay? And once we're in the door, do we see ourselves? So as students, do we see faculty of color who look like us, right? Black people who look like us, but also do we see a diversity in thought? And for the most part, I don't think that we see a diversity in thought. I also believe that we have a whole body of research as it relates to Black people and, issues of equity, especially equity in education. But what we don't have is these pedagogies that are equitable, and the outcomes aren't equitable. So, and I would say it's more than a feeling. I think it's been documented that there's a gap between equity research and equity in practice, and equity as a set of pedagogies or thoughts.
I think I would add to that, like from my standpoint, a lot of people engage in research, and many of us are doing equitable or equity-minded research, but that's research that, is not shared with practitioners, it's not shared or placed in front of policymakers. Oftentimes, I think for folks in higher ed, it's shared with journals, right, and amongst scholars, and that's one way to engage one's work, but what it does is create a disconnect in terms of audience and reach. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is not just about, how we get this research in the hands and, in front of people who are actually doing, or engaging in the practice, but how do we translate it? Like it doesn't mean anything for me to send an article, any article I've written, to a policymaker. They're not going to read 30 pages, right? So how does it get translated, and how do we create recommendations and implications that are, actually feel like they can be implemented? And so I think to me, it is not that there isn't enough research out there. There certainly is research. It sounds like somebody's driving. There's the research is out there, and as Dr. V mentioned, many of us are doing work on how Black students survive and thrive regardless of institutional context. Really, how they just live, right? It's out there. But what are the venues and what are the streams to, how do we get that information in front of people who are actually engaging in the work, the people who are decision makers, around this work, and the people who actually have influence, who can make evidence-based, right, and research-based decisions, because, the information is out there. And I think many of our institutional leaders, and within the context of HBCUs, there's so much coming at you, right? So many things that you have to worry about. And so I think it's really incumbent upon researchers to think about ways and strategies to connect with people who are doing the work, right? And to translate that work so that it can be implemented.
Andrea?
Yeah, I think this is a great entry point to talk about some of the specifics of our report and how we at FDPRI try to align not only our research methodologies, but the practices that we do as practitioners. For Black feminists, we would call it praxis. How do we walk the talk? For critical race scholars, Dr. Robin Hughes always talks about crit walking. How do you walk the methods? How do you actually live them in your practice? And I think what we have found, and we often encounter in traditional research resources, the things that Dr. Lloyd referenced as far as like these traditional means of publication through journals, but also with research institutes who go about doing research on institutions rather than doing research with them. At FDPRI, we aim to do research alongside the institutions that we are helping to assist build capacity, inform practice, and also expand our knowledge on what they're producing in the fields of higher education. So with this report, we really aim to use only one framework that is applicable in these environments to support Black students and their student success. This report highlights specifically Black feminist thought and its principles, and how those principles are embedded and echoed continuously in the things that we see as evaluators in the field. And so I think by connecting the two, by walking the talk, actually walking the research, doing it in practice and alongside as participatory researchers, it is our aim at UNCF to do so with culturally relevant methodologies that not only speak to the environment, but speak along and give those participants voice. They center them.
So I think that's something that I heard from everyone, and Dr. V, you stated pretty explicitly is, one element of what you talked about was the belief in these practices, or the belief that it's important to use, culturally relevant approaches, et cetera. For those in the field who do have the belief, how do they merge into practice? How can we merge equity-centered research and practice in higher education? And what do you think are some barriers, right, for those people who do have the belief, who do want to do the work, that exists for them in terms of implementation or practice?
That's a good question, LaToya, because I was starting to think about, even as a clinician, I have to take a different approach than I do as a researcher, than I have to do as a policy analyst and advocate. And I think I was thinking about this, right? Because I had the privilege of reading the report. Thank you, Nadria. And I could say it reminds me of, remember that math class that we hated like in 7th grade and then again like junior year in high school, and we thought that was the end of our academic career, where we learned about probabilities? I still don't understand probabilities, but I do know that, the idea or the mindset behind probabilities, the way that it was taught to us anyway, is that if we threw a bunch of different color marbles into a bag, we had an equal probability of pulling out a certain color. And I think that that's how we tend to see equity in higher education. We think of it as equal outcomes. And so even though we may be using the phrasing equity focused, equity minded, equity research, really what people are talking about is equality, an equal chance of being pulled out the bag. And we see it everywhere. And I know, Lori, she's the department chair. So this is the part where she might want to just like mute her mic so she won't get in trouble. But we see these games all the time. We see it in, when institutions of higher education are being sued because they were told that they floated Black, candidates to the top, or we see it in our hiring practices and institutions of higher education where they say we want to give everybody an equal chance, of applying for this position. And so they float, they say, oh, we're going to reach in this bag, this very diverse bag of, candidates, and see what we pull out. Well, equality is not the same as equity. Equity takes in mind, historical oppression. It takes in mind it takes into consideration the residual effects, the latent effects even of, white supremacy and structural racism. And so we're dealing with two different mindsets. One, let's pull them out the bag and give everybody an equal chance. Whereas equity is saying we understand the impact of white supremacy and structural racism and how it affects people's opportunities and how it can affect outcomes. Okay, so I just talked about two different frames of references. And so how we start to move towards more of an equity model, I believe, LaToya, is that we have to consider not only who we bring to the table, but also their approaches. So we're talking about, as your report stated, we're looking at our methodologies, we're looking at our epistemologies, our ways of thinking, because what institutions tend to do, they tend to recycle their own. So you can look different from the outside, but that doesn't mean that your thinking is different. So when we're talking about how do we reach outside of ourselves, we're looking at policy, that's stated policy or implicit policy, but also explicit policy, right? We're also looking at curriculum. And we also have to give consideration to diversity of thought. So those marbles that they were teaching us, those games of probability, they were still marbles, just a different color. And so that looks like equity is research, it's pedagogy, it's curriculum, and it's praxis, as Nigeria said.
Dr. Patton Davis.
To me, so I agree with everything Venus said. To me, it looks like centering voices, as you all, did in the report. It is resisting this one-size-fits-all approach. To me, it is about accountability, and I think about it as, reparations. Like, how do we right these historical wrongs? And equity in many ways should look like representation and action, right? So it's not just about diversifying the faculty, right? It is making sure that you are creating or cultivating the conditions for these faculty that you're bringing in to be successful. Similarly, it's not just, being able to say at the beginning of the year, oh, we recruited this many students, right? It is what is going to keep them there and ensure that they're successful and that they're not just surviving, but also thriving. And it's definitely making concerted efforts, right? To resist, the environment of, white supremacy that many of our institutions are situated in. I think for people who, claim equity mindedness or who are genuinely engaged in this work, you can't be afraid to be vocal. You can't be afraid to make people uncomfortable. So I think equality keeps us comfortable, right? Because the same people are getting, the same benefits, right? But equity makes us think about the people who, one, haven't been at the table, may have built the table, but were not sitting at it when decisions were made about them. It is, to me, one of the ways I like to think about equity, there's this idea of looking to the bottom. This critical race scholar, Maria Matsuda, talks about looking to the bottom. And her argument is that if we start with the most vulnerable population, right? The population that really, in many ways, depends on our regard. If we think about how a policy, a practice, a program, how it might affect that population. And if we realize that, okay, this, whatever we're trying to create will benefit this student, and, everybody benefits. But if we start from, oh, well, the overwhelming majority of students will, benefit from this, then we lose students, right? We lose these, the most vulnerable student, the ones who, as Kimberly Crenshaw talks about, the ones who fall through the cracks. And so equity mindedness is sort of flipping that on its head and really paying attention and caring, as you all noted in the report, caring as, this active educational responsibility, caring how the most vulnerable student gets taken care of and how they're treated and how they're regarded through the educational process.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything Dr. V and Dr. Lori stated, and I do want to highlight some of the points that they made. I think it's really important, as Dr. V talked about, is to think about positionality of researchers. How do you come to the table? What lens you have, and that's particularly important when you decide what type of methodologies and methods you decide to use when you're thinking about research and evaluation. But for us at FDPRI, and as it highlighted in the report, we are particularly interested in making sure that our methods are not race neutral or race blind. that they give the context, they build the story, they build on the assets. We are always going to seek the goodness in these institutions. The challenges will always come to the surface, but it's about building the assets. And then, you know, this report draws from a lot of the work, primarily the work that we do with the Career Pathways Initiative with the Institute for Capacity Building. And in that work, we are helping and supporting institutions think about institutional transformation, how they might adjust and adopt new practices, as well as build on the ones that they have historically done and has been historically undocumented for quite some time to promote student success. And what I really like to think of it as is that where LaToya always talks about a cultural shift, we're helping to shift the culture. We're not assisting in stripping the culture. So when we're talking about evaluation, we don't want to assist in stripping the culture from these institutions. We're shifting. You know how it's funny, you know, we always use reality show scenarios. You know how Nene always says she wanted to, or Cherie says she wanted to shift her wiggle and move it a little bit. We don't want to take it off. We just want to move it a little bit. Yeah. So yeah, you wanna shift and assist. You don't want to strip.
Thank you. We touched on one of the principles that was highlighted in the report as principles from Black feminist thought that we've used to build upon for culturally relevant practice. And the principles that we use are leveraging lived experience to mine meaning, assessing knowledge claims through dialogue, caring as an act of educational responsibility, and centering cultural experiences as an act of resistance in research. What theories, literature, or mindsets should practitioners ground themselves in as they begin to shift their organization or institution's practice to having more of an equity-centered approach? Often, I think people are entering into equity-centered work without these kind of foundational, research practices, methodologies, et cetera. We know that for this report and for this set of work that we're describing, we use Black feminist thought, but that is not all encompassing in terms of what's available for people to use and start with to ground themselves in equity-centered work. What are some other theories, even researchers or research or work that's been done that you would propose people use to begin to do this type of work?
I can start. So, and thinking about this, Black feminist thought, of course, is always, an amazing starting point. But I also think critical race feminism. There was earlier mention of critical race theory, but critical race theory, critical race feminism is one, standpoint to start this work. But I have been, I guess as I think about my own work, I try to think beyond the box, with theory. And there are some ways that I think we can glean theory that isn't just so, perfectly, complete with tenets and, all of these different characteristics. I love, more recent work. It's actually been out there, but I think now it's named. So when we think about work on Black futures and, alternative realities, and we think about the fact that someone can create a syllabus out of Lovecraft Country, right? I wonder what practices could we get out of Lovecraft Country, right? Or, that someone could take Beyonce's Lemonade, right? And create something completely academic, right? A syllabus, to pull from that. And so I think the way, HBCUs can do this. They have already been doing it. There's already, someone could actually look at what HBCUs have been doing and create that as a theory, right? That other institutions can use to learn how to treat Black students. But I believe that there are plenty of frameworks, whether it's, Patricia Hill Collins, whether it's, Kimberly Crenshaw, Black women been doing this, right? Creating theoretical frameworks, and Black scholars have been doing it. And many of them have been doing it in, HBCU contexts. And so I think it's important to think about how do we call that information? How does bell hooks work operate as theory, right? To inform the practices that are successful in supporting students at HBCUs. To me, it's already there. It is how we, again, I use this word a lot, but how do we translate it? How do we map on this brilliance, to what we want to see, and naming, using it to name what is already there. There's just a lot of richness, I think, in HBCU context, these unnamed things, unnamed structures that fly under the radar. And so how do we use the work of Black scholars, critical Black scholars who, been thinking about and imagining and, engaging in these, ideas around world making that can shape and shift how people understand and value the work that's taking place at HBCUs.
Yeah, I agree with Lori. I think we already have the answer. I think what happens is that we begin to play this very Eurocentric Western game of trying to always name, categorize, sort, and then rank our knowledge. And that's intentional. I mean, that's what supremacy does, right? You name it so that you can categorize it, sort it, and then rank it. And sometimes we do that. We've been socialized to do that, to reproduce certain knowledge claims. And so what I like about the direction Lori is going in, I mean, some people have called it meaning making. Some of us have called it the mosaic, right? Others like Kimberly Crenshaw has referred to it as intersectionality. And so when we start thinking about Black intellectual thought with HBCUs at the center of our thinking, our mindsets, and our habits, is we have to go back. For me, I always go back to Sojourner Truth. I mean, imagine how bold it was to speak in your own tongue, to call on your own ancestral spirits, right? And to be bodacious in front of the other. And we have to return to that. And so I know Patricia Hill Collins talk about this as truth telling. Imagine what truth telling would have looked like 4 weeks ago. We told them what white people were capable of. We told them that they are capable of mass violence. We told them that they were capable of defying law and order. We told them that they were capable of trying to take down our democracy that we all built, right? So where does that come from? That comes from an ethos of truth telling. And it may not have a name, as Lori says. And I was telling someone yesterday, a group of scholars, doc students and tenure track faculty, I explained to them, I've never heard my grandmother say while telling a story or trying to help me understand something, well, Miss Thomas said back in 1998, page 2, unquote, and that's not even, that's not true to who we are. That's not a part of our regular discourse. And so something else I try to explain, Latoya and Nadria, is I also try to explain to people who are doing this type of equity minded work, keep in mind that for most of us, this is not our first language. In fact, I switched when the Zoom light came on and started recording. I said, well, let me go into academic English right quick and talk like this. Now, for all intents and purposes, Black English, the South Side of Chicago dialect, is actually my first language, which is not even my children's first language. My children's first language is actually academic English, right? They always say, Mom, you sound so funny. Mom, you sound like you're from Chicago. Well, right? And so what happens when we stand in truth as our lens for understanding equity, right? Is not as linear, is not as formalic, is not very clean, but it's also bringing forth something that is more equitable, something that is more collaborative, to Nadria's point, right? And something that is also, it can stand the test of time. And that starts with, and so I'm gonna, Lori named everybody I would have named, so I'm not gonna use her sources because she can run circles around me. But I was thinking, when she was still in the names that I was gonna name, I was thinking of people who were somewhat, that I've admired their work near and afar. Sean Hopper, right, Lori? Because he has some great unapologetically Black work as it relates to higher ed. So what would that look like if it's informed not only by Black people or Black man, but what would it look like if it was centered in the cultures of HBCUs? What if we started there, right? Or if we applied his work specifically to the context of HBCUs and the K-12 students that many of our HBCU alums serve? I would, of course, Kimberly Crenshaw, which she stated. Also, I like Joyce King. I love the work of Joyce King. I think her book, The Transformation of Black Education, should be the Bible of what we teach in, K-12 students. If not K through 16, pre-K through 16. I mean, she has an Afrocentric, she calls for an agenda for Black education, but a transformative Black education, starting with African people across the diaspora. Of course, I always go back to Septima P. Clark, for people who, are more interested in a more inclusive education, right? Because that's about protecting our human rights and civil rights. Of course, Gloria Booty, another Black woman scholar who centers, Black people, Black culture in our K-12 curriculum. I think of Geneva Smitherman, but also Geneva Gay would also be two scholars who give a lot of focus on Black education. And some of these experiences, by the way, are deriving from an HBCU experience, right, Lori? Like they're coming from HBCUs or they taught at an HBCU and now they're just in PWIs, most of them. And they're trying to now teach white teachers how to teach our children or remind us Black folk how we used to teach on that front porch and how we were taught by our grandmas and them. Right. And I would say too, Jacob Carruthers. I mean, I have to return to his work on intellectual warfare to even remind me, why do I have to say that I'm a research and policy scholar? Why does it matter that we stay up close and personal in the faces of these institutions that we physically and intellectually and culturally keep building and rebuilding when they try to destroy themselves from the inside out? Intellectual warfare. And that, because I know some of us, right? And Adria and Latoya, I had the privilege of working with you all as scholars, as researchers, as writers, and as activists, intellectual activists. And I can tell you, we sometimes feel guilt and shame when we stay so close to these institutions that seem oppressive, that aren't equity-minded, but they have the language. We'll come up with the language and they'll co-opt it and take it from us and gut it of all meaning and action. And it's usually going to benefit a white woman, by the way. And so with that said, right, intellectual warfare as a text, even if it's on our tables, our bookshelves as just a reference, it reminds us that we don't have to feel guilt and shame for being attached to an institution, or we can think of it in a more specific way as holding them accountable and responsible to us and ours.
The only thing that I would add to that wonderful commentary on methodology by both Dr. Lori and Dr. V is the politics of citing, who you cite and where you cite them. Dr. Lori knows this. I am a stan, for lack of a better word, of Dr. Jean Noble, who is our ancestor in higher education scholarship. She is one of the first to do work on, about Black women at HBCUs. When she was doing the work in the 50s, 1950s, that's centrally where you might have found Black women who were enrolled in college. So for me, as my role as senior research associate at FDPRI, it's about keeping us conscious about who we cite, not being limited to the time limits. 10 years, cite someone within 10 years. If we stuck to the 10-year rule, we would never get to Jean Noble. We would never get to some of the great work of, HBCU graduates like Sean Harper. You would be stuck in this box of who to cite and where to cite them. And then I also want to bring up some great HBCU graduates: Albany State graduate Regina Bradley, Howard University graduate Brittany Cooper, all tremendous critical scholars doing work from the perspective and positionality of an HBCU graduate. It's my turn though, huh, Toya? So,
well, and Nadria, I was going to add too, I think that it's probably worthwhile stating, because that was great what you just did. Keep in mind that many of some of our greatest scientists, medical doctors, they actually hail from HBCUs in undergrad, and then they go on, to PWIs for grad school. So that's a self-esteem. That's self-esteem and a self-concept and self-awareness that we don't necessarily talk about as methodology.
Yeah, you're correct. You're correct. And I think that that's the work we hope to do as we expand the research agenda at FDPRI. So we're gonna shift where I'm gonna become host and Toya is gonna answer some questions along with the scholars. I know we want to discuss, we've talked about methodology, we've talked about policy, and they're all interconnected. What are some other ways that we can center Black students and professionals in the work that we do?
Well, since I'm on the other side of the game now, I'll jump in and kind of answer some questions. I think that, because FDPRI is at a very interesting intersection between executing research, but also using it for very practical purposes and creating programs and design with institutions and for students. I think that one of the things that I see is that organizations often gather to come up with solutions for inequity. I think I see the biggest failure is not including those who have been disadvantaged themselves in these, solution sessions. And I see this as a deeper issue of the replication of inequity, because there's again, back to belief, the idea of belief. There's a belief that those who have been disadvantaged have no idea what their needs are or no way to, find those solutions. And I think this is an example of exclusion permitting further exclusion. So we at UNCF and FDPRI, what I've enjoyed is that we know that there are various promising practices to working with institutions, so not on their behalf, but sitting with and collaborating on kind of unearthing these promising approaches and promising practices that exist. And I think the idea is to respect the cultural knowledge that comes from doing work with, or the cultural knowledge that we know exists in places where the work has been going on for years. Even if that work was done under dire circumstances, right? We know that HBCUs have been doing and producing, like Dr. V just noted, overproducing STEM graduates, overproducing in so many areas without the adequate support, without adequate funding, et cetera, and without the attention really that they deserve for what they were doing. But when we try to address the latter, issues, right, of not having the support, not having the attention, not having the policy, we don't start with those promising practices of how they've been doing the work without it. We don't start with kind of unearthing and detailing and sitting with institutions and addressing, trying to access the knowledge that exists about how this work has been done. And I think it's because there's an absence of just an asset-based approach. You approach it from the deficits, the things that they don't have, the things that don't exist. But as a researcher that contributes to program design, I always start with trying to unearth best practices, and that exists with the people at the institutions. It's the professors, it's the faculty that have been there for 30, 40, 50 years, or even brand new that see the value in what they're doing every day. It's the students who are never really accessed or asked, about their own experiences. The alumni that we know have such a deep and close relationship to their institutions. I live in Atlanta, where there's not one car tag that doesn't feature some different HBCU or some type of Greek association, et cetera, that may have they've gotten at their HBCU. And we don't ask them about why that closeness exists, why represent outside of that institution, what does that bond mean, et cetera, and how is that promising for the programs that we want to build, for student success, for institutional transformation. And I think that UNCF is uniquely equipped to do that because they also have that relationship with the institutions, many of their graduates, and then the students themselves. And so I think it's the relationship building and that asset-based approach that's the most promising for centering Black students and professionals in the work. I think it's required for the ability to do that.
As you were talking, Latoya, there were a couple of things that came to mind. I love everything you just said. When I guess think about the role of this institute and UNCF, and the sort of work that could be happening to enhance what's going on, I would love to see, just if we're going to serve Black students, one, I think our understanding of who Black students are has to be more expansive, right? I think typically in higher ed, we think, 18-year-old, right? 18-year-old to 24-year-old. And we also think, man, woman, right? I think we need to think about, who Black students are, and they have multiple identities. We are in no way monolithic, right? And there's a richness in every way that we show up, even as all of us Black, but there's, different, racial identities, ethnicities, gender, sexual, all these pieces that make up who we are as Black people. And in some of my work, it shows up that, Black students don't often feel that, right, on college campuses. So that's the one piece I think, how we help all Black students feel like they're a part of the campus environment, the campus culture. The other piece that I think is interesting. So, there's a lot of conversation, out there about US News and World Report rankings, right? Which those rankings, as we all know, if you dig a little deeper, they're real problematic because they don't have nearly the number of HBCUs on there that should be on there. But institutions rely on those rankings because it helps to recruit students. When students are looking for a college, they'll go to those rankings. And I think UNCF is poised to have a different ranking or a different way of highlighting all of the wonderful things that are on HBCU campuses using very different metrics, some of which could stem from the 4 principles in this report. That's one way, right? Like, let's help Black students to understand, here's the richness, right? You can go anywhere, but before you make that decision, look at HBCUs as well, right? The other piece that I think would really be valuable, not just for Black students, but for increasing a larger understanding around how Black students experience higher education. There are not many centers that focus on, the study of Black students, right? How they experience higher education, how they access it, what contributes to their retention, none of that. And I would love for that to be at an HBCU, right? Or something that is being sponsored or led by UNCF, rather than, I mean, it could be in partnership with, other institutions, but I think the home, that intellectual home should exist at, an HBCU. And there's the possibility, we've mentioned a lot of, Black scholars we know of, and we forgot to mention Gloria Ladson Billings, by the way. I believe she
Yes.
graduated from, which one is in Philadelphia? I can't remember.
Yeah.
Is it Morgan?
Morgan State.
Yeah, okay. But there are so many Black scholars who came from HBCUs who will rep their HBCU in a minute and would be more than happy to contribute to, some sort of think tank or some sort of ongoing dialogue about, how we continue to uplift HBCUs. But I don't think the mechanisms are not always there, right? But I think there is promise in pulling from these folks. They may have, graduated and gone on to other places, but their, the heart, their intellectual roots as scholars, not only come from their family life, but also their experiences at HBCUs. And so when we are, and that to me is one way to model to students who are, currently, in college, looking at, this is one way I can give back, right? This is one way I can contribute. This is one way I can stay, connected to the institution that I attended. And it also has some implications for philanthropy, right? There's, what's her name? Bezos' ex-wife, I can't remember her name, the one who, is just giving all her riches to HBCUs. And I completely respect that, and I'm glad that she's saying that, and she's sort of modeling, how philanthropic dollars can be spent. But I also, think it's important, one, that we cultivate those sorts of knowledges within our own communities and understand that giving isn't just around money. Like there is giving of time, there is giving of, intellect, there's lots of ways to give. And so I think there is promise in helping Black students, understand, once you graduate and, and you go through, the graduation, here are the ways that you can remain connected to this institution.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that was a great idea. I have nothing to add to that. I think she just actually dropped some nuggets for all of us here, right? She just gave us like a whole agenda for like the next 5 years. Like start here. I mean, I think LaToya and Andrea, you all have work now because she just gave you not only a framework but also an implementation model, and she named some key people that would be fundamental to a collaborative project that will sustain itself. I love it. Love it.
Dr. Lori is an expert at ideation. She has a lot of
stay on the idea, and
yes, you do
right now.
Yes, you do. And hopping back to Dr. Lori, Dr. Lori wrote a wonderful piece called, she wrote a piece with Dr. Shayla Haynes entitled Hidden in Plain Sight, the Black Women's Blueprint for Institutional Transformation in Higher Education, where she names Black women as possibility models for transformation in higher education. Dr. Lori and Dr. V, can you talk about, because we argue, while Dr. Lori argues for Black women as possibility models, Dr. Owens and I, we argue for HBCUs as possibility models for student success innovations. What are some areas in Black education that pose similar analogies but have not yet been recognized?
Wow, that's deep. Okay, so if Lori is like the model for ideations, let me tell you, that's exactly what I do with metaphors. Okay. So what I think is that there's possibilities in between and in the meantime. And it's what I call the that liminal space. And in my last body of work, I called for playing in the dark. Okay, and I said, what happens if we play in the dark? And so if we thought of this as double dutch, right? So Lori is saying, looking at Black women in higher education, you all are saying looking at HBCUs. So what if there was this liminal space where that rope, you know, and that beat to the rope kind of intersected? And I think that's what I call daughtering. And so not all of us are mothers, not all Black people are mothers, Black women are mothers, but all of us are daughters, right? We all are daughters. And from day one, we've been socialized to be good daughters, right? That's to care for our elders, to serve the men folk, to help take care of the children, and to watch our mothers, aunts, and grandmothers, right? And doing it with a certain level of discipline. So what if daughtering was our starting point? What would that look like if we studied that? And I'm talking the good, the bad, the ugly, the pretty. And I think we have something there. And so when I think about daughtering, there's always a level of humility. And from cradle to grave, we are daughters, whether we want to be or not. We even submit, right? So Lori and I, we see these things that you two are doing. You all still are being humble before us, but I'm also being humble before Lori. So it's really kind of weird, right? But that's what daughtering is, and that's what it does. So what can we gather out of that? Not only methodologically, but also theoretically, right? And then if we really want to play with language, what does that look like from an epistemological perspective? But now I just want to go a step further with what all three of us are proposing. What does that look like ontologically? Because that daughtering, that it factor that we don't have a name for, that's what's going to save us. So sometimes what happens in these spaces is we become who we think is modeling that role. So we always say we need role models. I have an uncle who says, no, we don't need role models. We need real models, because role modeling is a performance, right? So I like to think of this evolution that we saw in the feminist movement. And this is so bad. I hope Hillary Clinton never sees this webinar. But I remember when there was a time when women were working really, really hard to be seen as credible and good at what they do. And I think of Hillary Clinton, and we saw her like evolve from this, like the men would wear pantsuits to work, everyday suits and attire, right? So look at Don Mosley and Kenneth Jacobs here. And we saw women, they began in the 80s and 90s, they would adopt that same pantsuit. And they would add like these shoulder pads, and they wanted to look important. They wanted to look stern. They wanted to be taken seriously. But then you have people like Lori and I, we're looking at them like, man, that don't look cool. Like that don't look cool walking down the block, you know, on the South Side. It's just not, yeah. It was something we weren't feeling. It was like Hillary was faking the funk. And then recently we saw our homegirl Kamala, the great Kamala, right? Vice President Kamala. And she represented everything that was beautiful about Black women. But we also saw evolution, because remember, she came out in the pantsuit too. It was like, that's a nice, you know, pantsuit. And when we saw her in it, we thought, oh, she did that because she wanted to be taken seriously. She wanted to be seen as stern. But we also thought, oh, she's being very feminine in so many ways while also being comfortable. And that's who Black women are, right? Like, we're going to be taken seriously, but we want to be comfortable too in our own skin. And she rocked it. But guess who killed that pantsuit game? Michelle Obama. She was like, wow. We was like, who's she married to?
Yeah, I don't know. She went beyond the pantsuit, Dr. V. Went above and beyond. Above and beyond.
And that's what I think we need to think about our methodologies, our research methodologies, as it relates to, you know, who we're going to rep, but also how we're going to evolve humanity, how we're going to evolve these spaces. We always have to be okay with adding our own funk to it, our own beat to it. Let's remix it. Let's own it. Let's make it ours till they ask us, who did that belong to? Like, where did that come from? Yeah, and we have to have that type of cultural perspective. And I think we lose that because those who came before us were just trying to fit in. But some of us are standing up unapologetically and saying, look, this is who I am. I'm going to play in y'all game, but I would not become of your game.
just to, yeah, I don't know that I can add much more. It was hard to, think of, other examples of this. I think I guess the most recent one that I can imagine or come up with, I think about Stacey Abrams, right? And not so her Black womanness, of course, is front and center, but what she was able to do to shift, and how we understand what it means to root out voter suppression, right? Like what it looks like to quote unquote lose and stay winning. You know what I'm saying? That, I think she embodies that. Um, I just think it's important when and I don't, I try not to use role models as much. Like when we look at people and we admire what they're doing, it gives us, for some people, it gives us, an option to consider what might be possible. Right. And so that is sort of the spirit of possibility models, thinking about what could be possible. For a long time, nobody could imagine a Black woman president, let alone vice president. Right. It just wasn't in our oh, I'm trying to think from cognitive development. It wasn't in our paradigm for who is a vice president, And so I think broadly speaking that HBCUs are possibility models in multiple ways. Again, not always named, but in terms of predominantly white institutions, considering, how do we retain our students, right? They might want to look at what HBCUs are doing to retain their students. Or for some of these predominantly white institutions who have a really hard time letting go of tests, the GRE, ACT, all of these tests that we know are biased, right? And it's just struggle. Some people letting go because COVID is making them let go, right? COVID is putting the possibility there. But had they looked at what some HBCUs were doing and the fact that access looks different, access and investment in students looks very different. You don't have to recreate the wheel. I think plenty of HBCUs are already doing the work, doing it better and doing it with fewer resources. And so when I think about what's going on with COVID, my own institution is dealing with budget cuts and, budget shortfalls. You need to call the president of an HBCU who's been dealing with shortfalls in perpetuity, right? At the hands of the state, right? So there's the answers, I think, are there. The possibilities are there. And HBCUs, have been modeling it for a long time. And so when I think about, if I were ever to create my own institution, and it ain't gonna happen, but if I were going to create my own institution, I would look first at what HBCUs are doing, right? And that's not to say, imperfections don't exist. There's no perfect institution. But when I think about Black people and how we've made it, a lot of that rests with the work that has occurred at HBCUs.
Thank you all. We are just at time. So I want to just take some time to close out by going around and having, and we kind of developed a question around if we centered Black feminist thought at HBCU campuses, which it is. If we highlighted something within that framework, what would the HBCU campus look like? So if we could just go around and pick something to kind of end on, like, as we think about the intersection of Black feminist thought and HBCUs, Lori talked about the spectrum. We all know that Patricia Hill Collins did a phenomenal work, and it has been riffed and remixed and taken, so many different directions for the benefit of understanding and getting a full view of not just Black women, but the Black experience. So if we had at the intersection of Black feminist thought and HBCUs, what is a concluding thought we can end on? What could we take away?
I'll start with mine. So a lot of the underlying, theme within this has been, contributions of Black women, right? And I always think about, I was listening to, when I started listening to Angela Rye's podcast, she had Jamel Hill on there as a guest. And one of the things Jamel said is Black women been done known, like we would been done knew, what was going on. And so as I think about, what this might look like at HBCUs, I would love to see more Black women as HBCU leaders. I would love to see them represented on, the boards of trustees. I would love to see um, this idea of understanding Blackness in numerous ways really enacted, and I believe that is happening. But those are a couple of things. I think Black women in general have such great ideas, right? And have been forced to think in ways that, are just simply amazing. And so I think there's a lot that we can learn from Black women while also honoring them and not, I guess, stealing the ideas, but positioning them as leaders, positioning them as decision makers, positioning them as, faculty is one way I think Black feminist thought becomes, more of a reality on campus.
Mhm.
A practice from our work that I think really rises to the top for me is reimagining approaches and really using lived experience and honoring lived experience, and for that to show up in everyday practices, including who's designated as an expert, whose practices, whose research, whose just words and thoughts and ways of being are valued in the work that's being done. Not replicating from outside of institutions, but replicating from inside based on the knowledge that's been developed there and the expertise that lives there, I think is truly one thing that we have to focus on, that I think is transformational. And I think that, UNCF has really been intentional about a focus on lived experience through the promotion of in-house or HBCU expertise. And I think it looks like more in a continuation of that and an elevation of those voices to outside of that sector or realm. And I think that's a practice from Black feminist thought that I would like to see replicated and amplified even more.
Mhm. Yeah, and so I think of Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, and Ida B. Wells. And I think we need to return as a Black family, as a Black collective, to these ideas of resilience and resistance. I think sometimes we become nostalgic with whiteness, and we begin to romanticize our own experiences, whether it's back at home, our PWI experiences, our HBCU experiences, even our fraternal organizations and civic organizations. We romanticize them, and so I think if we center both resilience, this is how we made it, but also this resistance. And I think when my son, he was being facetious. Now, mind you, he survived everything from Columbine to this insurrection, right? And so he comes in and he pokes his head into my bedroom and he says, "Mom," he said, and he was talking about at the insurrection that happened at the Capitol. And he said, "Mom, I think us Black Lives Matter folk, we need to rethink how we organize." And I thought, well, and he was being funny, but I said, whoa, we will never be thugs. We're not. In fact, most of us have been taught not to be thugs, right? Not to engage in thuggery. That's entitlement as well. That's a privilege to be able to do that. However, when I thought about what he said, what resonated with me is that we do have to get back to this idea of intellectual warfare. On this continent, education was always meant to be a tool of resistance. And what would that look like if every teacher who came through our teacher ed programs were equipped with tools of resistance? What would happen if our kids, and some of us remember when we were in pre-K through 5, like actually learning the Black National Anthem, right, alongside the Pledge of Allegiance. So what would that look like if we knew we were learning in order to resist something or somebody?
That is an excellent point to wrap on. Thank you, Dr. V. I want to thank everybody for joining us this evening or this afternoon. And I want to encourage everyone, I dropped the link for the report in the chat, and it will be on all of our socials, as well as our uncf.org page. So please refer to it, cite it, do what you may with it, use it in the act of resistance and resilience. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. V. Thank you, Dr. Lori.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Inviting us.
Bye-bye.